I'm Lisa, and I'm really glad you're here. If you're new, welcome. This little corner of YouTube is about where we talk about cultivating a beautiful life in the second half. And sometimes that's our health, sometimes it's our homes, sometimes our gardens or our faith, but really it's all stewardship. And it's learning to receive God's gifts with gratitude and then leave them a little better than how we found them. And if that sounds like the kind of conversation that you'd enjoy, I'd love for you to subscribe. Now, I've been thinking about something. Why does beauty matter? Having visited some museums lately, it's just really gotten me thinking a lot about beauty. And I think that subject has intrigued me for a number of years because I don't believe that beauty's optional. And I'm not talking about luxury or extravagance. I'm just talking about beauty itself. Why does a sunset stop us in our tracks? Why do we stand in silence in an old cathedral? Or why does a handwritten letter feel different than a text message? And why does fresh bread coming out of the oven make a house feel like home? Why do flowers on the kitchen table in an ordinary day make it seem different? Why do we linger in an art museum a little longer than we planned, or run our hands across an old piece of furniture that someone made 100 years ago? What is it about beauty that nourishes something deep inside of us? I mean, I really do think that it nourishes us. It nourishes me. It's essential to me. And not because I need expensive things, or not because my house is perfect, because far from it. If you've been watching me at all, you know that we are constantly in the middle of another project, and I have rooms that are just utter disasters. And when I talk about beauty, I want to be careful because I'm not talking about wealth here either. I'm not talking about expensive homes or designer furniture or magazine perfect rooms. I think beauty has very little to do with how much money you have. And I know that because that's how I grew up. When my parents were first married, my dad was in dental school at the University of Tennessee. Well, actually before that, he was an undergrad when they were married. And they lived in old married student housing on Sutherland Avenue. And it had originally been built as temporary military housing for World War II. And so this was 20 years later, and it was still there. It was dilapidated and cold and shabby, and it just wasn't the kind of place that anybody dreamed of living. It was worn out, and it was torn down the year after they graduated and moved out. And years later, the newspaper ran a story about the history of UT's married student housing, and it had pictures of the original Army barracks. And so my mom cut it out, and she framed the article with the picture, and she wrote 4 words underneath it, and it said, or 3 words actually, "Our humble beginning." And she hung it in our home. Not because she wanted us to feel ashamed from where we came, but it was quite the opposite. She wanted us to remember. And she wanted us to remember that beautiful lives don't begin with beautiful houses. They begin with gratitude. And I love that she framed that. And she could have hidden that hard chapter when they were broke and struggling. And she didn't. Instead, she honored it because she knew that those little apartments represented hope and dreams and a young couple building a future together with almost nothing. And I suppose that's why I don't really mind not having a perfect house. If you walk through my home, you'd quickly discover that almost nothing is expensive or new. Most of my furniture has had another life somewhere before it came to us. And a lot of pieces were either hand-me-downs by family, or others came from Craigslist or estate sales or Facebook Marketplace. And a few have been sitting on the curb, or in one case, the dumpster even, just waiting for somebody to rescue them. And most of them aren't antiques, they're just well used. And over the years, I've painted them or stained them or changed the hardware or repurposed them. And I love that. It gives me creative outlet, and then nothing feels too precious. Nothing is so sacred that I'm afraid to actually live with it. And every piece came into our home with its own story, its own scratches and dents and history. And I'm simply adding another chapter. And I think there's something beautiful to that layering of life. And maybe that's why I love old things, because they aren't perfect and they've endured. And because somebody sat in that chair before I did, and someone gathered around that table, and somebody wrote letters at that desk and celebrated birthdays with these dishes. And beauty isn't found in perfection, it's found in the stories. And every home has the opportunity to keep telling them. Nothing is precious, but it's all lovely. And sometimes people will apologize when I come into their homes. Oh, don't mind the furniture. Oh, I wish my house looked nicer. Oh, I know it's old. And I always want to tell them, just please don't apologize. The warmth of your welcome will always matter more than the price of your furniture. And I've walked into magnificent homes that have felt cold and sterile, and I've walked into tiny homes where I never wanted to leave. And the difference was never the budget, it was the love. And I think lovely and expensive are often confused because they aren't the same thing. Lovely is a home where people feel welcome. Lovely can be fresh picked flowers from a garden and placed in an old jar. Lovely is bread baking in the oven. It's a weathered table around which people laugh and cry and pray and share meals. Lovely's a chair that's held decades of conversations and maybe even a few dog scratches. It's a life that's been well lived, and I don't think we're called to collect perfect things. I think we're called to cultivate lovely ones. Chris and I have had seasons like my parents, humble beginnings too. We've lived through years when every dollar mattered and wondering how we were going to make everything work, and years where there wasn't money for anything extra, much less things we dreamed about. And yet those years hold some of my sweetest memories. Because beauty doesn't arrive when your bank account reaches a certain number. Beauty begins the moment that you start caring for what God has already placed in your hands. A single flower in a jar, the loaf of homemade bread, a clean kitchen, a walk after dinner, a candle on the table, music playing while you cook, a handwritten note, fresh sheets on the bed, hospitality offered in an ordinary home. And these things don't require wealth. They just require attention and love. And life is wonderfully and sometimes frustratingly unfinished. And yet I still find myself setting the table, and I plant flowers, and I move furniture around, and I hang art, and I stop to admire the light coming through the window, or I open the door just so I can hear the birds chirp in the morning. And sometimes I make myself just a simple little lunch, and I carry it outside and sit among the flowers. And no one's out there, no one's there to be impressed, but somehow those little moments restore me. And I've often wondered why. And as I've gotten older, I've started noticing something, that we've become really good at making life efficient. But I'm not sure that we've become really good at making it beautiful. I think there were eras in time where we did a better job at that. Today we buy furniture that's designed to be replaced, homes that all begin to look the same, clothes that are fashionable for a season and then forgotten the next. And we rush through our fast food meals, and we rush through conversations and vacations, and we just rush through life. And we have more conveniences than any generation before us. Yet many of us feel strangely hungry for something that we can't name. And I don't think we're hungry for more stuff. I think that we're hungry for beauty, real beauty, not the kind that you buy, but the kind that you cultivate. And that word is becoming one of my favorite words, cultivate, to tend. You cultivate a garden, you cultivate a marriage, friendships, you cultivate your health, you cultivate your faith, and you cultivate a home. And nothing beautiful just happens. Someone tends it. Somebody creates it patiently and faithfully and usually without even any acknowledgement. But I've also been thinking about another word, and that's curate. We hear a lot of that word lately about curating our homes or curating our wardrobes, curating our social media, even curating our lives. And I understand what people mean, but I wonder if we've confused curating with cultivating. Because curating is just arranging, it's selecting, it's displaying, it's cultivating is different. Cultivating takes time. It requires patience. It requires faithfulness. You can't curate a garden into existence. You cultivate it. You can't curate a strong marriage. You can't curate deep friendships. And you don't curate wisdom or character or faith. All of those things have to grow slowly. They're cultivated, and oftentimes it's almost imperceptible. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Scripture uses so many agricultural pictures: seeds, vines, branches, fruit, harvest. And God rarely seems to work all at once. He cultivates. And sometimes I get frustrated because I think that I'm trying to curate a life that God intends to cultivate. And curating asks, how does this look? And cultivating asks, who am I becoming? And those are very different questions. One is centered with appearance and the other more with transformation. And transformation almost always takes longer than we want. And so sometimes that can be frustrating. But when I look back at my childhood, I realized that I grew up in a home where beauty mattered. Not because we were wealthy, and like I said, we weren't. My parents worked incredibly hard and nothing came easily, but beauty still mattered. And they introduced us kids to beauty through things like travel and nature and birds and art and books and music and great food and conversation. And as a little girl, I didn't realize that they were teaching me anything. I thought that was just normal life. And now I realize that they were cultivating something in me. They were teaching me to notice. And that's a word that I don't hear as much as I would like to anymore either. Notice. We've become incredibly efficient. We consume more information than previous generations have encountered. And I'm sure that, I don't know, I think that we are just not better at noticing. We walk through gardens with our hands looking down at a phone. We eat dinner while watching TV. We rush through museums taking pictures of the paintings that you don't even stop to look at. And we're surrounded by beauty, and somehow we've become blinded to it. And I remember driving to the store that I was managing about 80 miles away when Chris and I were newlyweds. And I enjoyed seeing the spring greening out and the red buds and wild dogwoods just in bloom all along the highway. And they were so dense and beautiful and bright pink. And my father-in-law came in later and I said, "Can you believe how many red buds and dogwoods were in bloom on the highway? Wasn't it beautiful?" And he goes, "Oh, I didn't see them." And I thought, how on earth can you miss them? But then I realized that not everybody sees because they don't know how to look. They just go through life with these blinders on. And I wonder if that's one of the enemy's greatest victories, not making us hate beauty, but making us too distracted to even see it. Because once you stop noticing beauty, it's a really short step towards forgetting gratitude. And gratitude changes everything. Sometimes, too, I wonder, what is the purpose of beauty? Is it just to admire or to own or to impress people, or is it deeper? And I think that beauty glorifies God when it is executed with excellence. If you consider the great masters in grand architecture and music and sculptures, but we can also glorify Him through beautifying our own spaces. And a few months ago, when my husband and I were in Chicago, we were at London House Hotel, and carved into the building was a quotation that I found to be profoundly noble. And it said in part, that we may leave this city not only no less, but greater, better, and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. And I stood there and I read it over and over because I realized that isn't just a philosophy for cities, it's a philosophy for life. I mean, what if we approached everything that way? What if our homes were a little more beautiful than we found them? What if our marriages were a little stronger than they were 10 years ago? What if our children left our homes more confident and more kind and more grounded in truth than when God first entrusted them to us? What if our gardens were healthier? What if our neighborhoods were more welcoming? Or what if our churches were more hospitable? What if the people who crossed our paths left feeling a little more seen, or a little more encouraged, or a little more hopeful because they spent a little time with us? You know, maybe that's stewardship. Not merely preserving, but improving. Receiving God's gifts and passing them forward more beautiful than they were when they were entrusted to us. I've been mulling that sentence around in my heart ever since I left Chicago, because I realized that that's exactly what God does with us. He doesn't merely preserve us. He restores us. He sanctifies us. He's making us more beautiful than we were when He found us spiritually. Slowly and patiently, one ordinary day at a time. And I think we've lost sight of that somewhere along the way. We've just become fascinated with convenience, efficiency, speed, ease, disposable things, and disposable furniture, and disposable clothing, and disposable relationships even, and disposable architecture, disposable appliances, disposable everything. And we just don't repair anything anymore. We just replace. And when something becomes replaceable, beauty, I think, gradually just disappears. Not all at once, but definitely little by little. And, you know, I remember walking through museums in Europe and standing in these old cathedrals and looking at these giant carved wooden doors that craftsmen had spent years creating. Years. And some of the cathedrals were built over hundreds of years. Can you imagine that today? That someone would dedicate years to just a single doorway, or months carving one capital at the top of a column that most people wouldn't even notice? Why'd they do that? Because excellence mattered, and because beauty mattered, and because the work itself was an offering, not to one's own greatness, but an offering to God. It was an act of worship. And I think that we've lost something precious. And it's not because we're less talented. We're incredibly talented. We have remarkable technology and amazing tools and information. And I mean, we've got more information than any generation in history. But information is not the same thing as wisdom. And production is not the same as cultivation. And cultivation is slower. It requires attention. It requires noticing and patience and presence and love. And a gardener understands this. You can't hurry a tomato, and you can't rush an oak tree. You cannot force a marriage or a friendship or character. And the best things in life grow slowly. And that's one of the reasons why I love gardening so much. And sometimes people ask me, why do I spend all this time out there, you know, pulling weeds and moving plants around? And it's because gardens teach me something every season. And God rarely works instantly. He cultivates the same way that He cultivates us. Pruning, watering, waiting, growing roots before fruit. And I suppose that's why Jesus talks so much about seeds. You know, the kingdom looks much more like a garden than a factory. A curated life may be admired, but a cultivated life bears fruit. I mean, do you remember what beauty feels like? It requires observation. It's about attention. Appreciating beauty requires paying attention. In modern life, our phones, our technology tends to steal it. And beauty is what attentive people begin to notice. And that brings me back to something that Edith Schaefer wrote. I've mentioned her before, but I highly recommend her book, The Hidden Art of Homemaking. And if you've never read it, do get it. It's available everywhere. It's still in print. And she wasn't writing about becoming an artist. She was writing about becoming attentive. And she believed that ordinary people glorify God through ordinary acts of creativity. Gardening, cooking, arranging flowers, setting a welcome table, writing and music, and creating homes where people feel safe. And she called it hidden art. And I love that phrase because most beautiful things happen where no one's congratulating you and nobody's giving you an award for making a great soup or for planting tomatoes or for ironing a tablecloth or for writing an encouraging note. But those are the things that shape lives, and they shape families, and sometimes they shape generations. Ordinary acts of beauty are acts of love. They aren't just hobbies. They're acts of cultivation. They're acts of worship. And like I said, they're acts of love. And what if we entered every conversation and every meal and every marriage or workplace or church or community, and it was just a little bit greater, a little bit better, and a little bit more beautiful because we had been there. And I often think about the verse in Philippians where Paul writes, whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever is just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, think about these things. And I always found it interesting that he includes the word lovely. And he could have stopped with truth or righteousness, but he didn't. He tells us to dwell on what is lovely. And have you ever noticed what happens when you do? When you stop to watch the sunrise, or you notice the fragrance of a flower, or you hear children laughing, or you listen to the birds before everyone else is awake, or you admire the craftsmanship of something designed, or you sit around a meal with people that you love, something changes on the inside of you, and your shoulders relax, and your breathing slows, and gratitude begins to replace anxiety, and joy returns. I think that our hearts were designed to respond to beauty, and I don't think that's an accident. I think it's because beauty tells the truth. It's not the whole truth. I mean, the world is still broken and fallen, but it gives us glimpses of the world as God intended it to be. Every beautiful thing whispers something about the Creator. And every flower, every melody, every act of hospitality, every well-loved home, every restored piece of furniture, every faithful marriage, they're all echoes of Eden. They're little reminders that God delights not only in what is useful, but what is lovely. And I also wonder if we've unintentionally obeyed the opposite command. Instead of dwelling on whatever's lovely, we spend hours dwelling on whatever's alarming, whatever's outrageous, whatever makes us angry, and whatever just keeps us scrolling or feeds our fears. It's no wonder that so many of us are anxious. We've trained our minds to feast on things that weren't ever meant to nourish them. And maybe one of the most practical spiritual disciplines we can recover is simply learning to notice what is lovely again. And not to ignore suffering or pretend that evil doesn't exist, but to remember that beauty also exists and that it is true. And that Paul tells us to think about that. You know, we're not merely consumers passing through God's creation. We are cultivators, invited to leave every place and every person and every season of our lives a little more beautiful than we found it. So let's keep honoring legacy and discerning purpose and passing beauty forward. Thanks for watching.